Okay, great. Thank you so much. So if I need like any technical help, should I ask Janice? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for taking the time to be here. I'm really excited. The last time I did a session for the SDE conference was back in May, I think, and it was just a really special, powerful moment. It felt very spiritual in some ways, connecting with other people who were on the same journey. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to this time together. I really hope that it will just be more like a group discussion. I do have some thoughts and some prompts and stuff, but would really just love to learn together and hear from you and to just riff off of each other and our experiences with multiculturalism. So before we get started, I wanted to just get a feel for who's in the group. And so if you want to, in the chat, to write about your cultural identity, so how you identify culturally, and then also what about this topic interests you. So you can write it in the chat. Questions are, how do you identify? Why don't I type that out? How do you identify culturally? And then what about this topic interests you? Oh, feel free to write that in the chat. For me, I'll just give a little background about myself. I am Chinese American. So I was born in the States, but grew up my early childhood in Canada and spent my teenage years in the States, and then spent most of my adulthood living in China. So that's where I raised my kids. That's where I lived for most of my adult years until just a few years ago when I returned back to the States. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and again, you know, this is a space where we are invited to just show up as we are. So if you don't feel comfortable sharing, that's totally fine. If you don't want your camera on, that's fine. If you want to eat or knit or have children in the background, that's all welcome. So thank you for just your presence and being here. Great. So we have, let me scroll back, a white passing Jew, Black American, white Southern woman, married to Argentinian, Italian, white North American disabled secular Jew, Jewish person, European immigrant settler, descendant living in Canada, Hungarian, living in Spain, Mexican, Latinx, Afro-Latina, German, Scottish background. So yes, so exciting that just the diversity, the plethora of cultures that are represented here. So I did want to say right from the start that I want to center the experiences of those who identify as multicultural, because yeah, there's just a lot of experiences and perspectives and skills that those of us who are multicultural have learned to navigate, and those are skills that we can bring into the way that we relate to our children and the way we practice SDE. So yes, thank you for all your input. I wanted to take some time to actually read a part of my book that talks about my multicultural identity, But before I go into that, I also wanted us all to take some time to, if you want, you can close your eyes, or you don't have to, but just to think of words or images that come to mind when you think of your multicultural identity. So what are some words or images, feelings that come to mind when you think of your multicultural identity? You can type that in the chat, or if you want, you can raise your hand and share with the group. Lost, hidden, stolen from me, passing, masking, torn, delicious and intersecting, confusion, lost, unclear, mysterious, code switching, deep and grieving, don't fit in anywhere, multi-layered. Yeah, thank you for sharing so vulnerably. I feel like there's a lot of heaviness and grief related to perhaps our multicultural identities. And maybe this is also an opportunity for us to reclaim some of the beauty of those identities, the just the gifts that we are and that we can receive and that we can practice because we are in those liminal spaces. We are in between in some ways, and how that can be a gift. You know, it is a burden and it is a gift at the same time. So you can continue typing those in the chat. I'm going to be reading a section from my book that talks about my multicultural identity, and hopefully that can lead us into our discussion. Culture is made and remade by people like you and me. It is not something solid or steadfast across time. It is something constantly in flux and open to suggestion. Instead of assuming that we are powerless against cultural norms, we need to understand that we have the ability to resist, act upon, and alter culture. Part of that work involves us acknowledging our own complex and intersectional identities that do not conform to the limits of any one culture. Growing up, I loved telling others the interesting fact that each of my family members was born in a different country. My dad was born in China, my mom in Vietnam, my older sister in Hong Kong, which was a British colony at that time, I in the US, and my younger brother in Canada. My parents always joked that if they had had another kid, they would have flown out to Australia to give birth. Even though I was born in the States, the reality is that my heart, my values, and my culture are connected to other parts of the world. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and it was there that I discovered hockey legend Wayne Gretzky, first tasted delicious Ukrainian pierogies, began studying French, and learned how to survive negative 20-degree winters. Throughout my childhood, I made regular visits to Hong Kong to, quote unquote, get in touch with my roots. There, I fell in love with Cantonese culture and experienced my first taste of independence, navigating the MTR and sipping on Vitasoy lemon teas while shopping at Le Yungai Ladies Market. My high school years were spent in small town Americana, where cow tipping was considered a teenage pastime. Despite being the only Chinese American in my class, I was proud of my roots, serving as president of the Asian American Club and wearing a cheongsam to my senior prom long before it became popular for white girls to do so. In contrast, the large college I attended had an undergraduate population that was nearly 40% Asian and was located in one of the most socially liberal cities in the United States. I majored in English with an emphasis on Victorian literature, but my interests were not exclusively Anglophilic. I was also just a few credits shy of minoring in Asian studies. I graduated, got married, and a few years later moved to Northeast China, where I picked up Mandarin Chinese, started a family, and raised my kids in a city of 16 million people. I lived in that city longer than I have lived anywhere. I share all this because it shows how I don't belong to just one place, one culture. I am not confined by any one set of norms and rules. Instead, I hold in my body a vast array of influences, values, experiences, sounds, smells, tastes, and ways of seeing. As Walt Whitman puts it, I am large. I contain multitudes. I am rich in my complexities and paradoxes as a multicultural person. In China, I may not be Chinese enough, and in America, I may not be American enough, but my goal is not to fit into those strict, well-marked boxes. It's to be unapologetically and wholly myself so that I can expand the borders of what it means to be a Chinese American woman and mother. Likewise, our societies and cultures contain multitudes, often in contradiction to each other. Culture is something that is dynamic rather than static, manifold rather than uniform, porous rather than pure. Being global citizens and multicultural people rather than ones who simply pledge their allegiance to one country, one system, and one culture means that we can have a sense of belonging without being owned. We develop a synergetic relationship with culture instead of one that is enslaved to it, recognizing our power to shape culture even as it shapes us. This empowers us to celebrate and challenge the cultures that define us. We can honor the beauty in our indigenous ways of being, as well as own up to the unhealthy patterns that we see in our culture. We can appreciate the freedoms and privileges we have while honestly calling out broken systems and rejecting internalized white supremacy. We can expose cycles of trauma present in our own cultures: shame, fear, violence, scarcity, racism, authoritarianism, patriarchy, misogyny, abuse. We can be agents of change instead of victims to tradition. So I think the reason why I wanted to bring that up is just to show how our identities are so complex, and the complexity of our identities actually allows us to stand apart from our culture in some ways, to stand outside of it so that we can sift through it and not feel like we need to swallow it whole in some ways, because we know that we are part of different cultures, and in some ways we are curating our own culture because we aren't part of any one culture. So yeah, I'd love to hear from other people what their experiences of multiculturalism is. If anybody wants to type in the chat or raise their hand and share with us some of their experiences of multiculturalism in their own lives.
I'll just share that I find this topic interesting, but I find that my feelings about it are also complex. But at first I was hesitant to share my cultural identity. I felt like, what? The word white, I identify with it, but I don't necessarily always feel comfortable with it. And then, but I found other people sharing, and I thought, well, that would be, I felt more comfortable then hearing it. Well, maybe it's something to be, to at least appreciate in some way. I don't know. So then I thought, my family has always made a point to um, uh, at least be conscious of our European heritage, and that's something that I appreciate. That I know that my family comes from Germany and Scotland, that we have those roots. I appreciate that's been a part of discussion. And I didn't realize this until you started talking about it, but my mom's 11 years she spent in Costa Rica as a child was also significant. I mean, in my own, I visited there with her, and it's just, there's many what would you say, perspectives, like different angles that culture is important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Cody. I know that I've been learning from different people, and for those who are sort of inducted into this culture of whiteness, the challenge is often to actually peel back the layers of what that means and to understand, okay, well, what is whiteness? And to know that you are actually connected to a particular culture, whether that's Germany or Scotland or Italy or whatever it is. And so not just to say like, oh, I'm white, but to go back into your history and to be more connected to those parts of yourself too, because I think that's when we can understand more of our identities and our actual connection to these different cultures and these different ways of being. Well, hopefully, oh yes, Brooklyn.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to start in the past. I kind of look at my heritage or my cultural identity now as like 8 people, or the people that I'm connected to in the last like 100 years, like people who lived between like 1850 and now-ish. Like that's how far I've been able to go back and find actual people and culture and see how it affects the now through people that I know and have met. So my grandfather was an enrolled member of the Little Shell Chippewa, and they are originally from the Pembina area. It was a borderland between Canada and North America. So it's just like right there on the border. And Little Shell was part of the chief of the Pembina band of Ojibwe Indians in that area, and connected with the Ojibwe Métis people. And they were like a polyethnic group of that were descendants of French traders and Ojibwe Indians that intermarried, and they were both like, couldn't be Ojibwe and they couldn't be settlers, and they created their own culture that was a mix of both. And Louis Riel, who was Chief Little Shell's cousin, the founder of Manitoba and the Métis Nation in Canada, is like, they were able to create and maintain that culture, whereas like the Little Shell who were pushed into Montana, my great grandmother, they were just floating around Montana trying not to be deported to Canada. So I'm like, this is all stuff that I was only able to discover like starting in 2000. There's only one book that has been written about the Little Shell people, and I didn't have access to that like cultural community. And only in the last 2 years do we have federal recognition. And so more cultural resources are being like available to me. And I'm listening a lot to that connection, because I feel like those are the actual bones that are in the ground that I can access here, whereas it's a lot harder to access the bones of my European ancestors across the ocean, right? And also that stuff was always available, right? Like the stuff about European heritage is just right there in front of you everywhere. So anyway, it's been a really big journey, and it's really powerful to just nail down all of those really specific stories. And that's just what I wanted to share. And also as a mixed person of all these different places, like you're talking about, the Métis story means a lot to me, because there's like Irish jigging in it and like more traditional indigenous dancing. It's like a new culture and a new way of being that they created. And I just think it's an inspiring story. So, thank you for listening.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Brooklyn. I love how you're just talking about the history, just your connection to the history and the stories of your people. And I think sometimes when we grow up, we're, at least for me, I'm just more focused on like my own experiences, what I myself have experienced and the culture that I am growing up in. And it's not until we take the time, excuse me, to go back, a generation or two or many, 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 to see sort of the lines, the narratives, just all that's happening, and have a bigger picture of how we got to where we are. I think it's so important for us to like feel connected to our past generations so that we know like, how did I end up in the States? There's just so much history there. And so I think that's a really an important part of understanding ourselves and our culture and our stories. So thank you for all those who are sharing in the chat as well. Hopefully there will be more opportunities for you to share. We'll break out into small groups, hopefully near the end of this, so that people can share more. But can I share my screen? Okay. Okay. So, how multiculturalism can expand our practice of SDE. So this is just something that I found and have experienced myself being in multicultural settings. 5 elements of cultural competence, and this is on an individual level. So I wanted to unpack this together a little bit and see how it can relate to our own experiences, as well as how we relate to our children and how we practice SDE. So for those, just some cultural competence skills. The first one listed here is acknowledging cultural differences, where we go into new situations and we witness and observe without the need to put into a hierarchy, without the need to colonize, to sort of like make other people like us, so that there is no cultural difference, where we're really celebratory and recognize differences. But I think this is really important because we're not aiming for necessarily like a post-racial world, or one where we're colorblind or culture blind, where there's really a celebration of difference and we're not intimidated by difference. So
Iris, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we can't see the slide. I can't see the slide that you're talking off. Like I just see the first one.
Oh, is it stuck?
Yes.
I don't know that you have started the slideshow. We can see on the left all of the ones that are coming. Does that make sense?
On my screen, it's working.
Hmm.
It's fine. I'll just do it this way. Can you see it now? Okay,
Yes.
I had changed it into slideshow mode and maybe it messed up that way. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Yeah, so the first one I was talking about was acknowledging cultural differences. So we're not aiming for uniformity or assimilation. We're actually really celebratory of differences. And before I moved out to China, we were given some cross-cultural training. And one of the things that really stuck home with me was that things are not bad or wrong. Like when you go into a different culture and you notice something, it's not bad or wrong, it's just different. And so how to remove this sense of judgment when things are different, but to observe it, to notice it, and to just go, that's different. So I know that when I lived in China, the driving and the traffic initially really just jarred me because the traffic rules in China were just suggestions. Like if the light turned red, that was simply a suggestion. You could roll right through it if you wanted. And at first, I could approach it in a very judgmental way. Like, why aren't people following the rules? These people are so uncivilized, they're so backward or whatever it is. But then what I noticed also was that people had a lot less road rage. Like if somebody was inching into your lane, then you just inched over into the next lane. If you wanted to stop in the middle of the highway and back up because you missed your exit, that was totally fine and nobody was bothered by that. And so just learning to see things not as like right or wrong, or, obviously there are, it can be dangerous, but if everybody knows these unspoken rules and work around them, then it's just another way of being. And so by the time I left China, I was actually, appreciative of just how people were just able to flow and move around each other without being so rigid and strict and like upset if people didn't follow the rules. So yeah, not wrong, but different. So that's one of the elements of cultural competence. The next is to understand your own culture. And so where culture is like water to a fish, we don't really know that we're living in water. We're surrounded by it all the time and we're not actually cognizant of it until maybe we are removed from that situation or somebody outside is looking in at us and can recognize, oh, you're in this particular environment or have this particular perspective. So I think once we are placed or exposed to a different culture or need to navigate between cultures, we become more aware of what lens we have, our own biases, our perspectives, because we come into contact with people who have different perspectives and different lenses and different beliefs. And so that sort of exposes to us the fact that we have our own perspectives and biases too. So I think that's also just a great skill that we can have as multicultural people to know that, there is no objective perspective, that we are all subjective, and that is actually helpful to recognize that as we go into different situations. Third is to engage in self-assessment. And again, this is like the invitation and opportunity to understand ourselves better, our own culture better. Why do I do the things that I do? Why do I believe the things that I believe? If we are surrounded constantly by people who do the same things we do and believe the same things we believe, then we're not actually challenged to ask those questions. But when we are exposed to people who live in very radically different ways, that's an invitation for us to ask those questions of ourselves. So I know that when I first lived in Asia as a Chinese American, I had to deal a lot with my own identity issues. Like, who am I? Where do I fit in? You know, how do people perceive me? And who do I want to be? So being a multicultural person really invites us into that process of greater self-assessment and self-awareness. The next one is to acquire cultural knowledge and skills. So I think that means that we go into different situations with curiosity, with a learner's mindset. We go in as students. So if I'm going into, like, if I'm an Asian American and I go into, like, I go to China and live there, I am not going in as with a teacher's mindset, like, this is the way we do things, and how can I teach you how to do things the way I do it, or to see things the way I see it. It's, we go in and we are students, we're learning, we're curious. We know that we don't have it all figured out. And so there's, so avoiding that colonizer mindset of wanting to go into a situation and assuming superiority, assuming that others need to conform themselves to us, but instead going in with a lot of humility, a lot of curiosity. The last element listed here is to view behavior within a cultural context. So again, that resisting judgment, resisting the need to label things as good and bad, but curiosity, again, to know, like, okay, if they're behaving in this certain way, there's a reason for it. This is also, a skill that we use in parenting, looking beyond the behavior to the need underneath. And one example that I have is just in Asian culture, slurping while you're eating is very much part of the culture and not viewed as uncouth or rude or anything like that. And so not to come in with those Western lenses and say, like, oh, these people don't know how to behave or whatever. It's actually can be very complimentary for you to be slurping your noodles to show your host how much you enjoy it. And so again, not to view behavior with our own framework, but to view it within that cultural context. So I think for us, can we think of any examples of cross-cultural experiences that you've had and what you have learned from it, how you can use those competencies and those skills to learn how to relate to other people or practice SDE? You can type it in the chat or unmute yourself and share if you'd like.
Iris, can you ask the question again, please?
Sure. So do you have any examples of cross-cultural experiences and what have you learned from it?
I suppose I can share. If nobody else did, I can't really see my hand raising things. Okay. My best friend is Egyptian, and her and I went to Egypt together. She took me there, And there were a lot of like of judgments that came up as a American person. The way they eat, the cleanliness of the space versus like what I'm used to here in America, and really pushing past those judgments and be more observant of it, which I can't say that I was successful all the time in doing. And also I found like by the end of the trip, because we went, I was there for a few weeks. So by the end of the trip, I was really enveloped in it and immersed, I should say, that's a better word, and felt more comfortable than I had in the beginning. And when I came home, I was telling, everybody in my family about what I experienced and how, and their judgments on it, and just that cycle or that domino effect. But yeah, even where I learned the judgments, something that I actually really like about the culture that, in these COVID times is not even remotely appropriate, but we were there. We were actually there during this time. Like it was the end of 2020. And I took a huge leap to go there. But there was, you eat off of the same plate. So all of the food goes on the same plate, and you eat off of different spoons or whatever, but you eat off of the same plate. And the way my friend describes that is the energy that everybody brings to the table goes into the food, and it makes the food tastier. And the way she describes it is really beautiful, way better than I'm describing it. And I really loved it. And when we lived together for a little bit, so when we did live together, I would always encourage her, like, let's eat a different style. And I remember telling one of my aunts that this is how we ate, and her face just like immediately changed, like how disgusting that is, and exchanging of germs, and then amidst COVID, like how dangerous it is, and so yeah, that's an experience I have at the forefront of my brain. That was a real is a real interesting, that superiority of my culture is better, the way that we do things is better is such a crock of shit. So it is a very colonizer mindset, and pulling ourselves out of it, how hard it can be depending on where you come from.
Yeah. Sorry, who was it that was sharing that? I couldn't see who was sharing.
My name is Carice. I don't.
Yes.
I can't really see a lot of people either, but yeah, I'm Carice.
I have my my big screen share on, so I can't see everybody. Thank you for sharing, Carice. And I loved I think because we're not going to get things right all the time. Like I know that when I go into different cultures, there can be judgment. And I do feel judgment, and I do feel like I'm labeling sometimes, or that I feel like my way is better. Or I know that when I was living in China, I felt like there was a lot of internalized racism as well. Like I did not want to associate with being Chinese because of my judgment of some of the things that they were doing. And so I think it's not that we're going to get things right, or we're not allowed to feel these feelings, but to notice them, to allow them to name them, and then to recognize, okay, where is this coming from? And is it that colonizer mindset of like, my way is the right way? And to question it, right? So it's not to say that we're always going to have the right mindset going into these different situations, but always to question it. And I think in terms of like our practice of SDE, when we see our children making choices that make us feel very uncomfortable, where we feel like we know the right way and they don't, for us to question that mindset as well, like they are their own person, they are experiencing something different. I have a certain perspective, I can bring it up, but it may not be right or wrong either. It may just be different. And can I allow for that difference? Can I hold space for that difference? Or do I feel like I need to colonize and make them do what I want to do, to assimilate to my values and my perspectives? Or can I hold space for this difference? Can I hold space for their own beliefs and their own perspectives? So.
Can I try to word something that's coming to my brain?
Please.
I think what you're saying is touching on sorry, I'm trying to find words. Even biases or judgment on our own culture, like me feeling ashamed of being American. And I find that a lot in my own community of people, where we are all people, but we are Americanized. Our parents came over to give us a better life, and so, and when we go back to the country where we came from, you know, like if I go back to Mexico, everybody knows I'm American, not just because the way I speak Spanish, the way that I speak language. I don't know the lingo, just my mannerisms. And that shame, feeling that shame in myself. And I see that a lot in my friends who are ashamed of being American and place judgment because this is with some calling here, all the history behind how we got to be America. So I just wanted to share that because it feels like it has to be said and named that we can have judgments on our own culture, a culture that we were raised and grown up in. And I struggle with that because sometimes I remember having a conversation maybe just a few months ago with somebody and saying, you know, like, whether you like it or not, you are American, because if you go back to El Salvador or Mexico, like, they're gonna know that you're American. And so how do we sit with that and not feel shame around it and acknowledge the history and acknowledge what being in America has, like the value it has brought, if you know, yeah, I just felt like I needed to say that out loud.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, just struck again, that question of our identity. And I think that's something that we all have to wrestle through. And, you know, maybe it's going to be a lifetime of that, trying to figure out who we are and the shame that's associated with different parts of our identity, and how we can sit with that and just, yeah. I don't necessarily have an answer, but to sit with that shame and to, again, name it, question it, hold space for it. So I'll move on to the next slide and we can continue discussing. So this was on an individual level. The researchers who did this also talked about on a communal level, where they called it organizational level. I don't really like that word, so I called it communal level. But this is just in like our communities, how we can bring these skills of cultural competence into our communities, where again, we value diversity. I don't know if that's the proper term anymore. But again, there's no assumption of uniformity. There's no assumption that like all of our experiences or perspectives are the same. There's more of an assumption of like anything, you know, anything can happen. We're going to bring all of ourselves and all of our intersectional identities into this space. second is to conduct self-assessment. So again, to encourage each member of that community to become more self-aware, to avoid judgment, to understand themselves better, manage the dynamics of difference. So because you're not trying to create a culture where everybody is the same, where everybody fits into a certain standard or uniform, mold, then you're going to have a lot of difference and potential conflict. So this is where a lot of good communication needs to happen, where boundaries need to happen. So I think of like, okay, maybe in an SDE space where you have a very outgoing, extroverted person who wants to constantly engage with other people and is very vocal, very assertive, and you have a more introverted person who wants to do things by themselves, who needs more quiet. So you have to negotiate what are the rules of engagement, I guess, in this situation, right? It can't just be like, okay, well, all of us are going to work together on this today, or like just everybody in their own corners doing their own thing. But you have to navigate, and like each person has to communicate what their own boundaries are so that each member can show up fully as they are. And sometimes that requires, when you have a shared space, when you're in community, it's not always only about your own needs. You have to navigate everybody's needs. And so that just takes a lot of conversation, a lot of negotiation, and a lot of respect. To embed cultural knowledge, where, again, you're not just giving one dominant narrative of how to see the world, but that you teach about differences. There is a history from diverse perspectives. There's representation. So in these communities that we are creating, hopefully there is space for that as well. And the last element is to adapt to diversity, which is, again, like not a majority rules and majority wins type of ethos, but one where that is very inclusive, that is constantly adapting and adjusting to the different needs of the community. So I'm not sure if you are part of SDE communities or just other communities that you are a part of, but do our communities have these values? Do they look like this? And how can our communities grow in these values? Let me type that out. So do our communities look like this, and how can those communities grow in these values?
I think it's a great question. And I did have a technical question. Would it be possible to do the view of everyone while we do discussion? Is that possible?
Sure.
Back and forth, or
Let me stop this.
without losing your slides, I hope. My community at this point consists of, our household, we have a lot of, we have a lot of time together. I have 3 boys and between 4 and 10 years old. So especially right now when it's cold out in Kansas. The weather is cold, so we're spending a lot of time together. I think my wife and I both want our kids to know about some cultural diversity beyond just obviously our neighborhood. You know, we live in a white neighborhood. And our church community that we connect with is pretty homogeneous. So I think there is a lot of room for growth. I mean, I think it's an open-minded congregation, denomination, but you know, I think that there's a lot of space. Okay, so and as far as SDE, like that's another whole thing. We have kind of an unschooling co-op that we connect with. And I kind of wish there was more discussion of culture within that group, but it's mostly focused around activities and trying to find things for kids to do. And our church actually did have a discussion around race this last year. So, you know, there was a book discussion. So there's been some learning. I think that there's also a lot of room for more in-depth discussion and, you know, exploration.
I
Yes,
feel a little
Lauren, go
nervous.
ahead.
I feel a little nervous to public speak, but my business partner and I started an unschool this year, and we'd been part of spaces that had the values kind of as you described them here, valuing diversity and decentering whiteness, and then didn't actually look like that in practice, because if you're not kind of being active, then you're going to kind of replicate what is the dominant American culture, which is whiteness. And so we've really been working to be really active in understanding how our whiteness shows up in the space. And I think part of that work for us has been as a facilitator group. So it's 2 white women, an Afro-Dominican woman, and a Black man, and kind of doing a lot of identity work ourselves. And I really resonated with the understand your own culture from the personal section, because we did some identity work where we were naming our 3 core identities and everyone named their race except me. And I was like, well, I reject whiteness. And in that conversation, what's associated with whiteness to me, which means like white supremacy and, you know, everything negative that goes along with that. But I came to understand how my rejection of that was me choosing not to acknowledge how my whiteness shows up in a space, whether I associate with it or not. And so I think what we're doing in a community is like doing this identity work ourselves, and then asking our community to do that with us and inviting them into spaces and conversations that aren't always comfortable, and we're making missteps, you know, the 4 of us as facilitators, and how we're facilitating that for people, and then inviting our community to share back with us how our missteps have affected them, or how they wish we were doing identity work, so that we could kind of be growing on this path together, and just really having the conversations and like putting it on the table, and growing trusting relationships, so that when we do inadvertently harm each other, there is trust to fall back on, and then we kind of have some practice in having difficult dialogue so we can repair and move forward in a better way.
That is so good, Lauren. Thank you for sharing that. And just to echo I want to say the fraughtness, that's not a word, but how fraught these conversations feel for me to be in community as a white person, and the fear of misstep, and but yet the necessity of these conversations, and also just the the necessity of them, and just how important it is that we have built these loving and trusting relationships. I mean, we can call them safe spaces. Some people are rejecting that term now and saying, no, we need brave spaces. So I don't know what the best terminology for this is, but this idea of like these loving and trusting and honest, it takes a vulnerability, and it takes this kind of willingness to go into hard spaces and have each other's backs. And I feel like there's very few spaces like this in the world. And anything we can do to create those in our families and in like the communities we find ourselves, whether it's churches, the SDE spaces, the homeschool co-ops that we're in, is very worthwhile work. It's just, it's stuff I feel nervous around.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experiences. I know that these conversations can be, like you said, very fraught. And I know that Crystal, who's here, wrote a whole book called The Token. I don't know if you want to share anything about that, but you can pick up her book and read it. And like we mentioned, you talked, Renee, about the fear of misstep. And again, that's like one of the cultural competencies where we go in assuming that we're going to misstep. And if we go in assuming that we're not going to get it right, that we're going to, make mistakes, then I think it makes it safer, braver, for us to have those conversations where we're open to the accountability and the pushback and the learning that needs to happen. So I think hopefully going into these conversations and these spaces with that humility, with that curiosity, with that openness, is like, I don't know, I want to learn. I'm going to misstep. I'm going to do the work that I need to do in order to make this safe for other people and for me to grow as well. And so hopefully we can all go into those spaces. Yeah, hopefully somebody put the link.
Yeah, the link is there. When you were saying, Iris, just that last part about being able to go in with humility and the potential of failure and the knowing that we can work it out, I really feel that unschooling self-directed practices grow that posture instead of a system approach to education where it's like, oh, you cannot expose your belly, right? your weakness, you just have to and you have to come out on top. I mean, that's the whole thing is set up that way. And so I have hope around these practices and pedagogy and communities as tools of change and relationships for change in this.
Yeah, where we're not entering into spaces or conversations knowing what the outcome is going to be, feeling like there's only one right answer, right? We go in with a lot of openness, with just a word that a lot of people have used is just emergent, right? We don't know where this is going to take us. And can we be okay with that? I'm actually going to share the next slide because some of it is in this next slide. Where these are just different skills that we can have as we grow in our cultural competence, where we go in as observers, acknowledging, identifying, instead of unconsciously going into situations and just going in unconsciously and not recognizing that we have our own lens, that there's different what's actually happening in the situation. I really recommend the Free Child podcast, the one about Maori motherhood that Akila Richards and her co-host for that series did. I thought it was really great in terms of talking about witnessing, observing without judgment. So comparing and contrasting without judgment, or even not even needing to compare and contrast, maybe just holding space for it, noticing the difference without judgment. Negotiating meaning. I really like this as a skill because it's, again, the assumption or the lack of assumption that we all mean the same thing. You know, when we are speaking in different languages, when like the same word means different things in different cultures, we have to be very clear about what we mean. And so, you know, even with our children, negotiating meaning with them, like trying to understand, okay, when I say this is what I mean, but maybe that's not how you're receiving it. And so, again, being very more mindful and conscious about the way we communicate. Self-reflection, dealing with or tolerating ambiguity. I think that's what I was mentioning earlier with Renee, is just, it's not all cut and dry. You know, there's not formulas and you know, we can't take a test and get 100% on it. And that's not how things work in the SDE space. There's a lot of trust that needs to be built and a lot of, you know, faith because we don't know where this is going to take us. And can we sit with that? Can we tolerate it? Effectively interpreting messages, limiting the possibility of misinterpretation, defending one's point of view while acknowledging the legitimacy of others, accepting difference, nuance, otherness, humility, openness, curiosity. I don't even know if otherness is the right word, but yeah, just we are different. Like who I am and the way I see the world is different than another person, is different from my child. And can I accept that? So these are some skills that came to mind for me in terms of cultural competence. And I'm gonna stop my share so that I can see everyone. And I just copied and pasted that list into the chat so that you can see it. Are there other skills that you would add for those, you know, who, in terms of cultural competence, those skills that we can bring into our SDE practice, and how you feel like these skills can help you relate to the young people in your life and practice SDE?
Hi, I'm Anna. I live in Mexico. I was hesitant to share because I don't consider myself very multicultural, but my kids are. Since they were little, since they were like 2 months old, we have been practicing cultures, you know, like they have tutors from different countries. And now I have a 13-year-old and a 6-year-old girl, and the 13-year-old is a boy. And they speak 8 languages fluently, and they know the cultures because their tutors, they became part of our family, you know, like they're like aunts or family members who come and play with them because it's a very free environment where they share their interests and play together, talk about video games, you know, like just things of their own interest. And you were asking about what skills, you are part of that multicultural type of education. And I think more than a skill is a trait. I see my kids to be very empathetic, very loving towards people. Like when you were reading the slides, I noticed that they don't see the world like that. They don't see they need to tolerate differences. They see differences are just part of their lives. When they were little, they were asking me, Mom, how many languages do you speak? And I was like, barely, like 1.5. So I think, honestly, I think it's a great idea to start like when they're little, to just show them the richness of the world, and that the common denominator is just humanity, because that's what I believe everybody wants in their life, in their children's lives, for them to be loving to other people, because when they feel love, they are joyful. So I really encourage, I started this adventure just as an experiment. And when we started seeing the results, we were like amazed, like, okay, so let's do another culture. Let's do another culture. And they know of different religions, of different cultural celebrations. And all of that is just the content, but I see the process they're going through is just, empathy. And they're bigger than me, like they're more mature than the way I am. And for me, it's probably deconstructing my way of being right in the culture that I was raised. And it's harder. But I think if we want to like change the world, our kids are the answer. Everybody, I believe, bets on that, because here we're gathered because we believe in our children and in alternative methods to raise them. But as an adventurer, I encourage you guys to, try opening your home to different people, cultures. In Mexico, we're very traditional. We don't have multiculturalism yet. It was hard for me to find people from different cultures, but it's achievable. You are in first world countries, so it's easier for you guys to find that type of diversity. But I think it's just the decision to do it, and maybe it's not too late for us, but it's easier for them, for the children. So I just wanted to share this experience and the results that I'm experiencing in them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience. I do feel that like being exposed to different cultures, because we learn to step into other people's shoes, to see things from different perspectives, that can give us more empathy. And I appreciate that. I think a question that I have for myself, and the way I practice it too, in terms of exposing my children to different cultures, is how to do it in a way that isn't tokenizing, and again, maybe I need to read Crystal's book, because, we don't want to feel exploited either, or used to expand other people's worldview. We want to be seen as people. So how can we connect with other people in really relational, human ways where it doesn't feel exploitative, So I don't necessarily have the answers to that. It's just a question that I'm thinking of.
I think something, this is Joni, by the way, talking. Oh, we're on gallery view. So I think one facet to that is building stamina to do the work involves an ecology of practice. We are in discussion with places that feel safe for us, with the understanding that that can also be an echo chamber, whether it's in our own head, whether it's in our own communities. And so another ecology that we're needing to build stamina and practice around is being in right relationship, being in a healthy relationship, being in relationship with communities and with the communities and cultures within ourselves as well. So I think part of this, there's always an intra and an inter relationship. So I think that I think we have to also, we're building relationships, but if we're not in relationship with our own different communities, complexities, cultures within ourselves, I think it can also be difficult to be in healthy, like nourishing relationships externally as well. And I think like holding the complexity of these different ecologies is part of what will help us not tokenize and exploit and extract. Think of ways that our liberation can actually be oppressive to someone else. What we think of as freedom for ourselves in showing up, taking up space can actually be oppressive to someone in our community, to places of ourself that we suppress or push down. So I think there's a lot of places to practice these ecologies, multiverse ecologies that are always at play, whether it's our how our ancestors could show up has a lot to do with how we can show up. How are we able to embody these experiences has a lot to do with that as well. So I just wanted to speak that a little bit into the space.
I appreciate that perspective, Joni. I think especially if there are parts of our identity or our cultures that haven't been accepted in the past, we do need maybe our own spaces to grow in that ecology, to be comfortable in our own skin, to be able to like be fully ourselves before we enter into these other spaces, because maybe those parts of us were shut down or were dismissed. And so we need other spaces for us to fully show up and feel that safety without needing to have to explain ourselves, without needing to, tiptoe around so that everybody's, feelings are okay, where we can like be fully ourselves. And so there are different layers to this work for sure. Yeah. I wanted to just give us all some time to break out into small groups to discuss some questions. I have a few questions, and these are just prompts. You don't actually have to answer them, but included it in the chat. I think that when you break out into small groups, though, you can't see this chat. So if you want to like copy and paste it so that you'll have it, and then we can break out into breakout rooms. Do I do that or Janice? Okay.
Yeah.
So
tell me what you want.
Yeah. So maybe just groups of 3 or 4, and it can be random. So I know that was like very brief, and I'm not sure how much you were able to get into things, but hopefully these are just like, this is just the beginning of the conversation, just the spark of more reflecting and conversations that you'll have with other people. So I don't know, were there any last minute thoughts from anybody that anybody wanted to share?
Something that we talked about, we shared in our group a little bit, was kind of this this sense that we have this expectation, if you will, that we have to. So we talked about like colonial attitude and how that plays out with self-directed education and with our kids. And we talked a little bit about how, like, I mean, for me, it was kind of a realization that, let me back up. So that what we talked about was that there's this kind of expectation, almost this like idea that we have to be colonial somewhat with our kids. We have to be like, we have to tell them how things are supposed to be, and we have to direct them so much. And it's an attitude that takes a lot of unlearning and sort of reflection. So becoming aware of it, we talked about that too. It's important.
Yeah, so one of my questions was, how can we treat our children like their own sovereign nation, like they are their own people, their own culture, and to not go in with the assumption that their culture is our culture, their perspective is our perspective. How can we go in with a lot more curiosity, respect, humility, going in as a student? Let's be students of our children instead of like, this is the way things are. I'm going to, be the one to teach you. I'm going to be the one to guide you and to impose my own perspectives and beliefs upon you and my own values. But really to go in with a lot more openness and communication, respect, all of those things. Yes. Hi.
Wanted to share, my own experience in terms of supporting my own children's journey, having four. I have a 21-year-old, a 16-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old. So each of their experiences have been unique. And I think for me, what's been supportive is getting connected with my own inner child, allowing her to start to choose and giving her permission, especially coming from cultures that were deeply wounded. I'm still trying to get in touch with my Indigenous side and what that means and how the language that I was forced upon, what that means for me and my children. And being married to a Ukrainian man who's also first generation American, and sharing his own experience has really allowed us to, just allowed us to heal our inner child so that we weren't given that opportunity as, prior to becoming parents, that we owe that to ourselves and in order for us to be able to show up for our children. And that's taken a lot of work to even acknowledge that investing in oneself is worthy. And that's something that my own culture identity kind of reminded me that I wasn't worthy of that. So challenging that notion and putting my own language has definitely helped me be supportive of the language that my own children are creating and developing, because their own sensory system is adapting and changing to all these environmental changes. So it's helping me stay a little gentler with myself. It's easier, I try to practice what I preach, and it's really hard, so it's to show up that way and to see my children feel so comfortable in showing up as themselves definitely shows me that it's been worth kind of going back, acknowledging that inner child of me and giving her an opportunity to just be so that they could be. So thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think, that's just when parenthood is just an invitation to do that, right? It's just it brings up so much of our own healing that needs to happen. And so, just like those cultural competencies where when we are faced with a different culture, that's an invitation for us to self-assess and be self-reflective and to understand our own culture and our own perspectives and who we are more, our own identities. And in the same way, parenthood does that. This other culture, this other person out there is reflecting back to us ways that we need to heal and grow and be more self-aware. So that's definitely just a core work that we have to do with this. So thank you. That. So yes, sorry, we have to wrap it up. I know that this is just, the start of the conversation. Hopefully it can, be a springboard to more thoughts on this. So thank you all for showing up, and I'll see you out there. Thank you.